I've never really been into Halloween, but I live in a pretty standard suburban neighborhood in Boise, Idaho, where Halloween is a big deal. Every year, the neighborhood turns into a trick-or-treating paradise. It's usually all in good fun, with parents walking around with their kids, houses decked out with lights and decorations, and everything feeling festive. For me, though, it's just another night. I live alone in a small one-story house. Nothing fancy, but enough for me. It's a quiet street, just far enough from downtown that you don't get a lot of traffic or noise. My neighbors are friendly enough, but we don't hang out much. Last Halloween, though, was different. It started off normal enough. Kids running around in costumes, parents following behind, the occasional teenager who's clearly too old for this, but still wants candy. I had a bowl of fun-sized candy bars ready, and every time the doorbell rang, I answered with a smile and dropped a few in each kid's bag. That's how the night went for a while, same as any other year. But then I noticed him. It wasn't like some big, dramatic moment. It was more of a slow realization that something was off. I'd been answering the door for a couple of hours when I caught sight of a guy standing across the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just standing there in a plain white mask. I figured he was maybe waiting for his kid or something. He didn't seem to be doing anything weird, just standing there. The mask was blank. No eye holes, no mouth, just smooth white like something you'd see in a theater production. I kept answering the door, handing out candy to the kids, but every time I looked up, he was still there, not moving. I even saw some of the kids glance at him, but they didn't seem to care. I told myself he was probably just part of some Halloween thing, maybe playing a creepy character for the night. But then, he got closer. The next time I opened the door, he was standing at the end of my driveway. I felt a small knot in my stomach, but I tried to ignore it. People do weird stuff on Halloween, right? I wasn't going to let it bother me. The trick-or-treaters kept coming, and I stayed busy enough with them that I didn't pay him much attention after that. A while later, the number of kids started to dwindle. It was getting late, around 9 p.m., and the rush had mostly passed. That's when I noticed the man in the mask again. He had moved even closer, now standing just on the edge of my front yard. It wasn't like he was hiding or anything. He was standing right there, in plain sight, just staring at my house. No kids around, no one else on the street. It was just him and me, separated by the distance of my front yard. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt the need to lock my front door. I walked over and slid the deadbolt into place. It felt a little stupid. He hadn't done anything threatening, just standing there. But something about it was seriously unsettling. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm down. Maybe he was just waiting for the last of the kids to finish. Maybe he was just messing with people as part of some dumb prank. I told myself 100 different things to make it seem less creepy. But then he knocked. The sound was soft but deliberate, like someone gently tapping with their knuckles instead of using the doorbell. It wasn't a loud or aggressive knock, just enough to get my attention. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. He didn't knock again, didn't say anything, just the one soft knock. I stood up and walked toward the door, but I didn't open it. Instead, I peered through the peephole. There he was, standing right on my porch, less than a foot from my front door, still wearing that blank white mask. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight ahead. I watched him for what felt like forever, waiting for him to do something, but he didn't. He just stood there. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone. I didn't want to call the police. He hadn't done anything wrong. It felt like overreacting. I figured maybe if I just ignored him, he'd get bored and leave. I turned off the porch light, hoping that would signal to him that I wasn't interested in whatever he was doing. Maybe he'd get the hint. But he didn't leave. Hours passed, and every so often I'd hear that same soft knocking. It wasn't constant. Maybe once every 15 or 20 minutes, just a light tap, barely noticeable if I wasn't paying attention. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but I couldn't stop thinking about him standing out there, just beyond the door. It was this creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't want to be the crazy person calling the police over a guy in a Halloween mask, but it was getting harder to justify not doing it. By midnight, all the kids had gone home. The street was empty and quiet, except for him. I hadn't looked through the peephole in a while, so I decided to check again, thinking maybe he'd finally left. But no, he was still there. Same spot, same blank mask, just standing there. I texted my friend, hoping for some reassurance. She told me I should call the cops, but I was still hesitant. What was I supposed to say? There's a guy in a mask standing outside my house on Halloween. They'd probably tell me it was just a prank and to lock my doors, which I'd already done. I decided to wait it out, thinking he couldn't stay there forever. I kept checking the time, hoping that eventually he'd get tired or bored and move on. But he didn't. Every so often, that quiet knock would echo through the house. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing, just this constant reminder that he was still out there, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to open the door, didn't want to confront him, but I also couldn't keep sitting there, knowing he was just outside. I grabbed a kitchen knife. Not that I thought I'd actually use it, but it made me feel a little better. Then I went to the front door and shouted through the wood, telling him to leave. I stood there waiting for some kind of response, but there was nothing. No knock, no sound, just silence. I looked through the peephole again, and to my relief, he was gone. The porch was empty. I couldn't see him anywhere on the street. Finally, I thought it was over. I sat back down on the couch, still holding the knife, feeling a little ridiculous, but also relieved. I stayed up the rest of the night, too wired to sleep. I kept waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. The next morning, I finally allowed myself to relax. It was over. He was gone, and Halloween was behind me. But when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Lying on the ground, right in front of my door, was the white mask. It was just sitting there, as if he had left it for me as some kind of twisted souvenir. I stared at it for a long time, not sure what to do. Finally, I picked it up and tossed it in the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It felt too bizarre, too random to explain. Who would believe me? A guy in a mask shows up on Halloween and doesn't leave for hours, then just disappears. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. But it happened. I know it did. Every time Halloween rolls around now, I get this tight feeling in my chest, like maybe this year he'll come back. I've started turning off all my lights and pretending I'm not home when trick-or-treaters come by, just in case. Nothing has happened since then, but I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm home alone at night. It's not like I'm living in constant fear or anything. Most of the time, I'm fine. But every now and then, I'll hear a soft knock on the door, and my heart skips a beat before I realize it's just a delivery or a neighbor stopping by. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and maybe that's the scariest part. There was no reason for it, no explanation, just a guy in a blank white mask, standing outside my house for hours, knocking softly, and then leaving without a word. I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways, but none of them make sense. Sometimes things just happen, I guess. Things you can't explain, things that stay with you long after they're over. I threw out the mask, but I can't throw out the feeling it left behind. I was driving home late from a Halloween event in Minneapolis last year. It was one of those annual Halloween festivals downtown, full of people dressed up, bars packed with costumed crowds, and everyone letting loose. I wasn't really in the mood to be out for long, so I left around 11 p.m. I had parked a little way off in a quieter area to avoid paying for the expensive downtown parking garages. By the time I was ready to leave, the streets had started to clear out, but the energy was still buzzing around the city. I drove a 2004 Honda Accord, nothing fancy but reliable enough for the drives I usually took. The streets were relatively empty as I navigated out of the downtown area, heading toward the suburbs where I lived. The air was chilly. It was one of those crisp, late October nights that made you feel winter was just around the corner. The roads were quiet once I hit the outskirts of the city, and I started to relax a little, thinking about how I'd unwind when I got home. I took one of the longer routes back to avoid the freeway. Not sure why. I think I just wanted to drive a bit. It was a 2-lane highway, one of those roads that gets little traffic late at night. It was mostly surrounded by woods and stretches of farmland here and there. There were hardly any streetlights, so it felt pretty isolated, but I didn't mind it at first. Driving on those roads late at night can feel peaceful, even if a little eerie. After driving for a while, I saw someone walking along the side of the road up ahead. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was kind of out of place to see someone walking along a dark highway this late. As I got closer, I saw that he was dressed in what looked like a beat-up costume, maybe an old pirate outfit. I slowed down a bit as I passed him, and he glanced over at me. He looked rough. His costume was dirty, like he'd been rolling around in the mud, and his face was grimy, tired-looking. He had long, messy hair and dark circles under his eyes. It was one of those looks that gives you the impression that something isn't quite right. I drove past him, but then I felt a pang of guilt. It was Halloween night after all, and he could have been in trouble. Maybe his car broke down or he got lost after a party. There wasn't much around for miles, and walking out here alone wasn't exactly the safest thing. Against my better judgment, I pulled over about 100 feet ahead of him, rolled down my passenger side window, and waved him over. When he reached my car, I could see him better in the glow of my headlights. He looked even rougher up close. His clothes were torn, and his skin looked dirty, like he hadn't washed in days. He told me his car had broken down a few miles back, and asked if I could give him a ride to the nearest gas station. He didn't look drunk, but there was something off about him. Still, I felt bad for the guy, and it was Halloween, so I didn't want to leave him stranded. Plus, it wasn't like there were many other people around who could help him. He got into the car, and immediately the air felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, But something shifted when he sat down. He didn't say much at first, just thanked me in a low voice, and we started driving. I asked him where his car was, and he pointed vaguely down the road, saying it was back there somewhere. I nodded and kept driving, figuring I'd drop him off at a gas station or someplace safer and be done with it. We drove in silence for a few minutes, but something about him made me uneasy. He was sitting stiffly in his seat, staring straight ahead, not saying a word. It wasn't the usual kind of silence you'd expect from a stranger. It felt tense, like he was waiting for something. I kept trying to make small talk to cut through the tension, asking him basic questions like what kind of car he had and what happened. But his answers were vague and mumbled, like he wasn't really paying attention. After a few minutes, I asked if there was a particular gas station he wanted me to take him to. That's when things got weirder. He turned to me, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, there wasn't a gas station around here that would be open this late. That struck me as odd because, while it was late, there were definitely a few 24-hour places around. I offered to look one up on my phone, but he just stared at me for a moment before saying it wasn't necessary. He said something about how he knew the area well and how there wasn't much point in stopping at any of the places nearby. The more we talked, the more uncomfortable I got. His stories didn't add up. He couldn't seem to describe where exactly his car was or how long he had been walking. He kept changing the details when I pressed him on it, like he was making things up as he went along. My gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I started thinking about how far I was from home, how empty the roads were, and how no one knew I'd picked this guy up. I glanced over at him again, trying not to be obvious about it, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His hands were resting in his lap, and one of them was partially hidden under his jacket, but I could see enough to realize he was holding something that looked like the handle of a knife. My heart started racing. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it before. It was like everything suddenly clicked into place, and I realized I'd made a huge mistake. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with this stranger who had a weapon, and I had no idea what his intentions were. I tried to stay calm, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might set him off. I told him I needed to stop for gas, making up some excuse about my own tank running low, even though it was nearly full. I tried to sound casual, like it was no big deal, hoping he wouldn't see through the lie. But as soon as I mentioned stopping, he tensed up. He turned to look at me again, and this time, there was something cold in his eyes. He told me we didn't need to stop, that we could keep going and figure things out later. His voice was calm, but there was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to get out of this situation, but I didn't want to panic. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. Then it hit me. I could crash the car. Not a full-on crash that would cause serious damage, but enough to jolt him and give me a chance to get away. I kept driving for a bit longer, waiting for the right moment, and then I saw it. A bend in the road with a thick cluster of trees lining the side. Without warning, I jerked the wheel hard to the right, aiming for a small tree just off the shoulder. The car veered off the road and slammed into the tree with enough force to send us both lurching forward. The airbags didn't deploy, but it was enough of a hit to knock the wind out of both of us. For a split second, everything was chaos. The sound of the car crashing, the jolt of the impact, the screech of metal against wood. But as soon as the car stopped, I unbuckled my seatbelt and bolted out the door, not even waiting to see how he reacted. I could hear him cursing behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. I sprinted toward the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going or how far I needed to run, but I knew I had to get away from him. The woods were thick, and it was hard to see where I was going in the dark. But I didn't stop. My legs were burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I kept running, hoping to put as much distance between us as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally slowed down and hid behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath. I crouched down, listening for any sound of him following me, but all I could hear was the wind rustling through the branches and the distant hum of the highway. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, until I was sure he wasn't coming after me. Eventually, I worked up the courage to head back toward the road. My car was still there, smashed into the tree, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. I grabbed my phone from the car and called 911, trying to stay calm as I explained what had happened. The police arrived after what felt like forever, and they searched the area, but they didn't find him. He had disappeared into the night, leaving me with nothing but the wrecked car and a story that sounded insane. The cops took my statement and gave me a ride back home, but they didn't seem too hopeful about finding the guy. They said it was possible he was just some drifter, someone who'd been looking for a ride and nothing more. But I knew better. I could still see the look in his eyes, the way he gripped that knife under his jacket. I'd been lucky to get away. It was last Halloween, and my friends and I decided to hit up a carnival that was happening on the edge of town. We live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the carnival was one of those pop-up things that come to town every year around October. It wasn't some big deal or anything, just the usual rides, food stands, and games. We thought it would be fun to goof around and see what it was all about. It wasn't like we had any better plans, and we were all too old to trick or treat anyway. We were seniors in high school, so hanging out at the carnival seemed like the perfect way to waste a night. There were 5 of us: me, Josh, Claire, Luke, and Emily. We'd all been friends for years, so we spent a lot of time together, especially on weekends. We arrived at the carnival around 7 p.m. and spent the next few hours riding the Ferris wheel, eating funnel cakes, and just doing typical carnival stuff. The atmosphere was fun, with people in costumes everywhere, and the whole place lit up by those bright, colorful lights that make everything feel a little surreal. It was packed with families and groups of teenagers like us, everyone just having a good time. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to die down. The carnival was closing soon, and most of the families had already cleared out. We were still hanging around, not really ready to head home yet, so we decided to walk back instead of calling for rides or taking the bus. It wasn't a long walk, about 20 minutes or so, but it was dark, and the route took us through some quieter streets. The carnival was set up in an empty lot near an old industrial area that wasn't used much anymore. We figured we could cut through the back streets and make it to the main road pretty quickly. We started walking, joking around, and talking about random stuff, not really paying much attention to our surroundings. The night was pretty chilly, typical for late October in Colorado, but we were all bundled up, so it wasn't too bad. The streets were mostly deserted, with only a few cars passing by every now and then. It felt like we were the only ones around, which was kind of cool in a weird way. It's not often that Fort Collins feels that empty. especially on a holiday like Halloween. After walking for a few blocks, we noticed an old van parked on the side of the street. It was one of those beat-up, creepy-looking vans that you'd expect to see in a horror movie. Rusted, faded paint, and no windows in the back. We made a few jokes about it as we passed, not thinking much of it at the time. But as we kept walking, I realized that the van had started moving. I could hear the engine rumbling behind us, slow and steady, like it was following us. At first I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure. It could have just been someone heading the same way as us, no big deal. But after a few minutes, it became clear that the van was definitely trailing us. It was keeping its distance, but every time we turned a corner, it would turn too. The streets were pretty empty by then, so there wasn't much traffic, and it was easy to tell when a car was following us. I nudged Josh and pointed it out to him. He glanced back and immediately noticed it too. We exchanged nervous glances, but didn't say anything to the others just yet. I think we were both hoping it was just a coincidence, and that the van would turn off onto a different street soon. But it didn't. We kept walking, trying to act like everything was normal, but now all of us were a little on edge. The van was still behind us, moving at the same slow pace. It wasn't speeding up, but it wasn't falling behind either. We walked faster, trying to put some distance between us and the van, but every time we sped up, it seemed to match our pace. That's when things started to feel really wrong. At this point, the others had noticed it too. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale in the dim street light. Luke tried to laugh it off, saying maybe it was just some creepy guy trying to mess with us because it was Halloween. But even he didn't seem too convinced. Claire, who's usually pretty chill, was the first to suggest that we should cut through a different street and lose the van. She pointed to an alley up ahead that led into a small park, figuring we could cut through and come out on the other side, hopefully losing the van in the process. We turned into the alley, walking quickly now, our footsteps echoing off the walls. I could hear the van slow down behind us, but it didn't follow us into the alley. For a second, I thought maybe we'd shaken it, that whoever was driving had finally given up and gone in a different direction. But then, just as we were halfway through the alley, I heard the sound of the van's engine revving up again. It wasn't far behind us, and even though I couldn't see it, I knew it was still there, waiting at the end of the alley. We picked up the pace, practically jogging now as we exited the alley and entered the park. The park was small, more like a large, open lot, with a few scattered trees and a playground off to one side. There were no streetlights here, just the faint glow from the distant carnival lights in the background. It felt eerily quiet compared to the noise and activity of the carnival. We made our way across the park, trying to act like we weren't scared, but I could tell that everyone was freaking out. I know I was. The whole situation felt unreal, like something out of a bad horror movie, but it was happening right in front of us. We were halfway through the park when I heard the van again. It was driving along the edge of the park, its headlights off now, just creeping along like it was looking for us. That's when we decided to run. I don't know who started it. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was Josh. But suddenly we were all sprinting across the park, trying to make it to the other side, where there were more houses and streetlights. I could hear the van speeding up too, its tires crunching over the gravel at the edge of the park. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt like they were on fire. But I didn't dare slow down. None of us did. We reached the far side of the park and darted into another alley, hoping to lose the van for good this time. We could hear it roaring behind us, but we didn't stop. We just kept running, taking random turns through alleys and side streets, anything to throw the van off our trail. The neighborhood we were in now was older, with narrow streets and houses packed close together, so we hoped it would be harder for the van to follow us here. After what felt like forever, we finally came to a stop in a small backyard behind some random house. We were all out of breath, gasping for air and drenched in sweat. We crouched down behind a fence, trying to stay hidden. The van hadn't followed us into the last alley, so we hoped that we'd finally lost it. We sat there for a few minutes, catching our breath and trying to figure out what to do next. That's when we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the other side of the fence. We all froze, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then we heard the sound of something scraping against the fence, like someone was dragging a hand along the wood. My heart was in my throat as I crouched there, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The footsteps started again, moving slowly along the fence until they faded into the distance. None of us moved for a long time, too scared to even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, we finally decided to peek over the fence. The street was empty. No van, no footsteps, nothing. It was like whoever had been following us had just disappeared into thin air. We didn't stick around to find out if they were coming back. We bolted out of the backyard and made a beeline for the main road, staying in the open this time where there were more streetlights and people around. We didn't stop running until we reached a gas station a few blocks away. The lights were bright, and there were a couple of cars parked in the lot, which made us feel a little safer. We hung around the gas station for a while, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. None of us could explain it. Who was in that van? Why had they been following us? And why had they stopped when we ducked into that backyard? We didn't have any answers, and honestly, we didn't want to stick around to find out. Eventually, we called for rides and went our separate ways, all of us still rattled by what had happened. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing those footsteps and the sound of the van's engine creeping behind us. We never reported it to the police. I think we were all too scared to admit how real it had been. It was easier to just pretend it hadn't happened, to chalk it up to some freak Halloween experience and move on. But even now, whenever I walk home at night, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that old van creeping up behind me again. I worked the late shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Chicago. It's not exactly the most exciting job, but it pays the bills, and for the most part, the night shift is quiet. Sure, you get the occasional drunk person stumbling in looking for snacks, or some college kids messing around on their way back from a party, but mostly it's just truckers stopping by for fuel and a coffee before heading back on the road. The station itself is nothing special, just a small place off I-90 with a few gas pumps and a convenience store. We're not close to anything major, just some warehouses and industrial buildings that stay empty most of the night. It's a pretty isolated spot, which I guess is why I've always felt kind of uneasy working there. There's something about being alone in the middle of the night that just gets to you after a while. The hours between 2 and 4 a.m. are the worst. That's when the silence feels heaviest. No cars on the road, no customers coming in. Just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I usually bring a book or my phone to keep myself occupied when it gets slow. But one night last October, something happened that I still think about all the time. It was the kind of thing that sticks with you, even when you try to push it out of your mind. It started off like any other shift. Same routine, same boring hours dragging by. But sometime around 3 a.m., I got a phone call that I'll never forget. It was one of those old landlines, the kind you hardly see anymore. The phone barely ever rings except when my boss calls to check in or someone's asking about the hours. So when it rang that night, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I picked it up, half distracted, expecting a wrong number or something. But what I heard on the other end made me freeze. A woman's voice, barely more than a whisper, told me she needed help. She sounded panicked, like she was trying to keep quiet, but couldn't hide the fear in her voice. She said someone was trying to break into her house, that she was hiding in a closet, and she didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to respond at first. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't the kind of call I was prepared for. I mean, I work at a gas station, not 911. But she was so scared I couldn't just hang up. I asked her where she was, trying to keep my voice calm, and she gave me an address. It was somewhere a couple miles from the station, not too far, but still in a more residential part of town. She kept whispering, telling me she could hear him moving around the house, that he was looking for her. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911 while still keeping the woman on the line. The dispatcher answered, and I explained what was happening, giving them the address the woman had told me. They said they were sending officers to check it out. I went back to the call, trying to keep the woman calm, telling her help was on the way. I asked her if she could still hear the person in the house, and she said yes, he was getting closer. Her voice was trembling now, like she was trying not to cry, and I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness. There was nothing I could do except stay on the line and hope the police got there in time. For the next few minutes, I just listened as she whispered updates, telling me when the noises got louder or when she thought he might be in the same room. Every second felt like an hour. I kept checking my watch, wondering how long it would take for the cops to get there. It felt like forever, but eventually I heard the sound of sirens in the background. The woman said she could hear them too, and for the first time since the call started, she sounded a little more hopeful. I stayed on the phone with her until I heard a man's voice. One of the officers, I assumed. She told me the police had arrived, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I told her she was going to be okay and hung up the phone, feeling shaken but glad I had been able to help in some way. It wasn't until after I hung up that the weirdness of the situation started to sink in. I went back to my normal routine, trying to shake off the adrenaline that had built up during the call. The station was still quiet, and the night dragged on like usual. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was exhausted. I drove home, crawled into bed, and slept for a few hours before waking up in the early afternoon. I couldn't stop thinking about that call, though. It replayed in my head, over and over. I wanted to know what had happened to the woman, if the police had caught the guy who broke in, if she was okay. But I didn't have any way of finding out. A few days passed, and I was back at work again. It was another late shift, and things were just as quiet as usual. I was halfway through my shift when the phone rang again. I picked it up, and my heart sank when I heard the same woman's voice on the other end. She sounded just as scared as before, whispering that someone was trying to get into her house again. It felt like déjà vu, but worse. because this time I knew how terrified she was and how helpless I felt listening to her. I asked her for the address again, and this time she gave me a different one, somewhere across town. I grabbed my cell phone, called 911 again, and explained the situation to the dispatcher. They said they'd send officers to the new address right away. I went back to the call, trying to keep the woman calm, but something felt off. The fear in her voice was the same. The way she whispered, the way she described the noises. It was all exactly the same as before. I asked her if she could still hear the person moving around the house, and she said yes. But the way she said it, something about it felt wrong. It was like she was reading from a script, like she was repeating the same lines from the first call. My mind started racing again, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank? But who would go to the trouble of calling a gas station clerk in the middle of the night just to pull a prank like this? The sirens came again, and just like the first time, the woman said she could hear them. She sounded relieved, but now I wasn't sure what to believe. I stayed on the phone until I heard the officers arrive. Then I hung up, feeling uneasy. Something wasn't adding up. The addresses were different, but everything else about the calls had been the same, too similar. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I didn't tell anyone about the second call. I figured it wasn't worth bringing up to my boss or co-workers. What would I even say? That I'd gotten 2 identical calls from a woman claiming someone was breaking into her house, but both times it had ended the same way. It sounded ridiculous. I convinced myself that maybe it was just some strange coincidence, or that maybe it really was a prank after all. Either way, I tried to put it out of my mind. But then it happened again. A week later, I was working another late shift, and the phone rang. This time, I didn't even have to hear her voice to know who it was. I felt this sick, sinking feeling in my stomach as I picked up the phone and heard her whispering on the other end. Same voice, same fear, same story. She was hiding in a closet. Someone was trying to break into her house and she needed help. But this time, I didn't call 911 right away. I hesitated, trying to figure out what was going on. I asked her for the address, and she gave me another new location, this one on the far side of town. I went through the motions of comforting her, telling her to stay calm, but inside, I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do. It was like I was caught in some twisted loop, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. I called 911 again, but I felt stupid doing it. I knew what the outcome would be. The cops would show up, and the house would be empty, just like before. But I couldn't just ignore her call either. What if this time it was real? What if she really did need help? The sirens came again, and just like before, she said she could hear them. The whole thing played out exactly the same way, like some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I hung up the phone, I felt sick. I didn't know what to believe anymore. After that, the calls stopped. I didn't hear from the woman again, and for a while, things went back to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I started looking over my shoulder more often, locking the doors to the gas station earlier than usual, and just generally feeling more paranoid. Every time the phone rang, I felt a jolt of anxiety, expecting it to be her again. But it never was. I was walking home late after a Halloween party in Seattle last year. The party was fun, But it dragged on way longer than I expected, and I started feeling tired. I didn't really know a lot of people there, so I figured I'd call it a night early. It was around midnight when I left the party and decided to walk home instead of calling a ride. It wasn't too far, about a 25-minute walk, and I figured the fresh air would help clear my head after all the noise and drinks. I don't live in a bad part of town, and Seattle's not usually dangerous, but walking alone at night can still feel a little eerie. The neighborhood I live in, Ballard, is generally safe and quiet. It's a mix of older houses, small apartment buildings, and a few bars and restaurants sprinkled around. At night, especially on Halloween, it tends to be busy, with people stumbling around in costumes or heading home after parties. But as I walked that night, it was quieter than I expected. I guess most people were either still out at the bars or already at home. I had my headphones in, listening to some music to make the walk go by faster, but I kept the volume low enough that I could still hear what was going on around me. I don't know why, but I've always felt better having some background noise when I walk alone at night. It keeps me calm, makes everything feel less ominous. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional car driving by. Every now and then I'd see someone walking on the opposite side of the street, but no one got too close. I felt safe enough, just eager to get home. I was cutting through one of the quieter side streets when I noticed someone behind me. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It wasn't uncommon to run into other people walking home at that hour, especially on Halloween. But after a few minutes, I realized that whoever was behind me wasn't gaining on me or passing by. They were just staying back, walking at the same pace. I glanced over my shoulder, trying not to make it too obvious, and saw a guy in a dark hoodie a little ways behind me. I didn't recognize him, but it was dark, and he had his hood up, so it wasn't easy to tell much about him. I turned back around and kept walking, trying to stay calm. People walk the same direction all the time, right? No big deal. Still, I couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. I adjusted my pace slightly, speeding up just a little to see if maybe I could create some distance. After a few more steps, I glanced back again. He had sped up, too. That's when the tension started to build. I could feel my heart rate pick up, and I tried to remind myself that it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe he was just another guy heading home, taking the same route I was. But then again, why hadn't he passed me by now? I wasn't walking that fast. I made a quick decision to cross the street, thinking maybe I'd feel better if there was some space between us. I crossed over to the other side, keeping my pace steady, trying not to look like I was panicking even though my nerves were starting to spike. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I'd been overreacting. But then I heard footsteps echoing from behind me again. He had crossed the street too. At this point, I was really starting to feel anxious. I pulled out one of my earbuds and tucked it in my pocket, listening more closely to the sounds around me. The guy was definitely still behind me, keeping pace, not speeding up or slowing down, just matching me, step for step. I kept walking, trying to think of what to do. There weren't many people around, and the houses on this street were mostly dark. If something happened, it wasn't like there would be a lot of witnesses or anyone to help me. I decided to take a few random turns, just to see if maybe he was heading somewhere else and would finally veer off. I turned down a street I don't usually take, a quieter road lined with old trees that blocked most of the street lights. It was darker, but I figured maybe I'd lose him that way. I picked up my pace again, walking faster now, almost at a jog. I didn't dare look back this time, too afraid of what I'd see. But then I heard it. His footsteps quickened, too. He was still behind me. Panic really started to set in then. I knew he was following me. It wasn't just in my head anymore. I felt like I was being hunted, and the worst part was, I didn't know what his intentions were. I had no idea what he wanted, if he was just trying to scare me or if he was planning something worse. I pulled out my phone and tried to look up the nearest police station, but my hands were shaking and I was having trouble focusing. I kept moving, taking more random turns, trying to lose him. At one point, I thought I'd shaken him off. I didn't hear his footsteps anymore, and when I glanced back, the street was empty. I let out a breath of relief, thinking maybe I'd finally lost him. But as I turned the next corner, there he was, standing at the end of the block, staring right at me. He hadn't been behind me anymore because he had taken a different route, cutting me off. I froze for a second, my mind racing. He was still standing there, not moving, just watching me. The street was too empty for comfort, and there wasn't anyone else around. I didn't know what to do, if I should run, scream, or just keep walking like nothing was wrong. I didn't want to provoke him, but I also didn't want to just stand there and wait for him to make the next move. I decided to walk, forcing myself to keep calm, even though every instinct was telling me to bolt. As I passed him, I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, just watched me. I walked past him, my heart hammering in my chest, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, and now he'd let me go. But as soon as I was a few steps ahead of him, I heard the footsteps again, this time faster, closer. He was following me, and now he was closing the gap. I didn't hesitate this time. I broke into a full-on sprint, running as fast as I could down the street. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, matching my pace. I didn't look back, too afraid of how close he might be. I just kept running, my lungs burning and my legs aching, praying that I'd find someone, anyone who could help. The neighborhood was still quiet, the houses dark. I could see a few porch lights in the distance, but it didn't seem like anyone was home. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Eventually I'd have to stop, and who knows what would happen then. But I couldn't just stop now, not with him so close behind me. Finally, I spotted a house with lights on inside. It was a small house with a picket fence, nothing special, but it looked like someone was home. I darted toward the front yard, not even thinking, just desperate to get away. I leaped over the fence and ran up to the door, pounding on it as hard as I could, hoping that whoever was inside would hear me. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, my heart still racing, and saw the guy standing at the edge of the yard. He wasn't running anymore, just standing there, watching me again. His hood was still up, hiding most of his face, but I could see the faint outline of a grin. He just stood there like he was waiting for something, like he knew I couldn't do anything. I kept pounding on the door, hoping someone would answer, but no one came. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped between the door and the guy standing at the edge of the yard. I felt like a caged animal, and the worst part was, he knew it. He wasn't in any hurry. He had all the time in the world, and I had nowhere left to run. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, the only sound being my ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. I don't know why, But eventually he just turned around and walked away. No rush, no urgency. Just like that, he was gone. I didn't move for a long time, too scared that he might come back. But eventually I worked up the courage to leave the yard and walk home as quickly as I could. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking I'd hear those footsteps again, that he'd be outside my window or waiting for me at the end of the street. But he never showed up again, at least not that I know of. I don't know what he wanted or why he was following me, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that something about that night felt wrong in a way I can't explain. I travel a lot for work, usually to small towns across the Midwest that no one's ever really heard of. My job isn't glamorous or exciting, but it pays well enough and keeps me busy. I'm in sales, and I spend a lot of my time driving between different cities, meeting clients, and staying in cheap motels along the way. It's not exactly what I dreamed of doing when I was younger, but it's routine now. I've been doing it long enough that I've gotten used to the long stretches of highway, the endless chain restaurants, and the isolation that comes with spending so many nights alone in unfamiliar places. Last fall, I was on a trip that took me to southern Indiana. I'd been driving for most of the day, making a couple of stops along the way for work, and by the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I pulled into this small town called Madison, a quiet place on the Ohio River. It was pretty late, and I didn't feel like driving any further, so I decided to find a place to stay for the night. There weren't a lot of options, just a couple of motels along the main road, and I ended up choosing this run-down-looking place on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of motel you've seen 1,000 times. An old neon sign, cracked pavement in the parking lot, and a handful of rooms that hadn't been updated in decades. It wasn't the worst place I'd ever stayed, but it definitely wasn't the best either. Still, it was cheap, and all I needed was a bed for the night. I parked the car and walked into the office. The front desk clerk was this older guy, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with a weathered face and deep lines around his eyes. He didn't say much, just asked for my ID and handed me a key after I paid for the room. There was something about the way he watched me that made me a little uncomfortable. It wasn't like he was unfriendly, but there was a weird intensity in his eyes, like he was sizing me up or something. I brushed it off as me being tired and overthinking things. I'd been on the road for too long that day, and I just wanted to get to my room and crash. My room was at the far end of the motel, away from the office and other rooms. I walked over, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was about what I expected. Dim lighting, faded floral bedspread, and that stale smell you get in places that haven't been aired out in a while. It wasn't great, but it would do for the night. I threw my bag on the bed, kicked off my shoes, and sat down for a few minutes just to relax. After a bit, I decided to take a shower before going to bed. The bathroom was small and a little grimy, but I've stayed in worse places. I turned on the water and let it run for a few minutes until it got hot. As I was about to step into the shower, I heard this creaking sound outside the bathroom, like someone walking slowly down the hallway. It didn't sound like it was coming from the room next door. It sounded like it was right outside my door. I froze for a second, listening. The sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. I figured it was just the old building settling or maybe someone from one of the other rooms heading outside. The walls were thin and sounds carried easily. I shrugged it off and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the tiredness from the day. When I finished, I dried off, pulled on some old sweatpants and lay down on the bed. I flipped through the channels on the old TV for a while, not really watching anything in particular, just trying to unwind. Eventually I turned it off and lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew I was waking up in the middle of the night. It was one of those disorienting moments where you wake up and don't know where you are at first. The room was pitch black, and it took me a few seconds to remember that I was in a motel in the middle of nowhere. That's when I heard it again, the creaking sound, like someone walking slowly outside my room. It was louder this time, more distinct. I held my breath, listening. The sound was coming from just outside my door, and it wasn't going away. It was this slow, deliberate creaking, like someone was pacing back and forth along the length of the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. I tried to tell myself it was just another guest, someone who couldn't sleep and was walking around outside, but it didn't feel right. It was too slow, too measured, like whoever was out there was taking their time, almost like they were trying to be quiet, but weren't doing a great job of it. I got out of bed and crept over to the door. The room was still dark, and I didn't want to turn on the lights in case whoever was out there saw the glow under the door. I stood there for a minute, listening to the footsteps. They were still there, moving back and forth outside. I thought about opening the door, but something held me back. I didn't know why, but the idea of opening the door made me feel sick with dread. I backed away from the door and sat down on the bed again, my mind racing. I couldn't figure out what to do. The sounds outside kept going, slow and steady, like they were taunting me, daring me to open the door and look. I reached for my phone, but the battery was dead. Typical. I cursed under my breath and sat there in the dark, listening to the creaking until, finally, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was like the absence of sound made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. I stayed frozen on the bed, straining to hear anything, but all I got was more silence. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing, just some weirdo walking around in the middle of the night. Maybe they were drunk or high, or just lost and trying to find their room. I tried to let it go. Eventually, I managed to fall back asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I kept waking up every hour or so, listening for the sound of footsteps, but they didn't come back. The rest of the night passed without incident, and when I woke up the next morning, it felt like a bad dream, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I got dressed, packed my bag, and headed to the office to check out. The front desk clerk was there again, the same old guy with the weathered face. He gave me a strange look when I handed him the key, like he remembered me from the night before, but didn't say anything. I thought about asking him if anyone else had been walking around last night, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. So I just left, got in my car, and drove off, feeling a little unsettled but glad to be getting out of there. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that something had been off about that night. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the whole place. The way the clerk had looked at me, the way the room felt wrong, like there was something there that I couldn't see but could sense. I kept thinking about it as I drove to my next destination, but I didn't have any answers. Later that night, I checked into a different motel in another small town. This one a little nicer, but still nothing special. I went through the same routine: shower, TV, bed. But this time, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The pipes creaking in the walls, the wind outside, even the hum of the air conditioner. It all felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I kept thinking about those footsteps outside my room the night before, the slow, deliberate pacing. I kept waiting to hear them again, even though I was in a completely different place. Every time I closed my eyes, I could almost hear them, like they were following me from one motel to the next, just waiting for the right moment to start up again. I stayed awake for most of the night, too wired to relax. When morning came, I felt like a wreck, but I had to keep going. I packed up my stuff, checked out of the motel, and hit the road again, hoping that whatever had happened that night in Madison would stay there, that it wouldn't follow me any further. But even now, months later, I still think about it sometimes when I'm alone in another cheap motel room. I'll be lying in bed, trying to sleep, and I'll start to hear those same creaking footsteps in the back of my mind. I don't know if it was real or if I imagined it, but it feels real enough that I can't ignore it. I still can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was outside my room that night wasn't just passing through. Last October, I took a babysitting job for the night. I was a high school senior at the time, living in a small town in Massachusetts, a bit west of Boston. The family lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, one of those older suburban areas with big houses that were all spaced out, a lot of them surrounded by trees. It wasn't too far from my own house, maybe a 15-minute drive, and I had babysat for this family a few times before, so I felt pretty comfortable there. The parents were going to some Halloween party, and they just needed someone to watch their 2 kids for the night. The kids were young, both under 10, and I knew the drill by now: trick-or-treating, a movie, then bed. The night started off normal. I got there around 6:30, and the parents were just finishing getting dressed in their costumes. They were nice people, kind of the stereotypical suburban couple, friendly, polite, and easygoing. They left for the party around 7, and I took the kids trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. It was one of those crisp fall nights, the kind where the air smells like leaves and the streets are lined with jack-o'-lanterns. There were a lot of kids out, and we hit up a few houses before heading back home around 8:30. Once we got back, I made the kids some hot chocolate, and we sat in the living room watching a Halloween movie on Disney+. They were tired from walking around, so it wasn't long before they started getting sleepy. By 9:30, both of them were ready for bed. I helped them brush their teeth and tuck them in, and soon enough, the house was quiet. After the kids were asleep, I settled in on the couch with my phone and flipped through social media for a while. The house was big and old, with that kind of creaky, settling noise that old houses have, but I didn't really think anything of it. It was almost 10, and I had the TV on low, just some background noise while I scrolled through my phone. Then I started hearing these faint noises coming from above me. At first I thought it was just the house creaking again, but the more I listened, the more it started to sound like something else. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking across the floor upstairs. I paused the TV for a second, trying to listen more closely. The kids were asleep upstairs, but their rooms were on the opposite side of the house. This noise was coming from above me, like from the ceiling above the living room. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an old pipe or something shifting around. But it was weird because it didn't sound like a random noise. It was rhythmic, like someone was taking steps and trying to move quietly. I tried to ignore it, figuring I was just freaking myself out for no reason. But the noise didn't stop. It would come and go, like whoever or whatever was moving, was being careful. There'd be a few steps, a pause, then a few more steps. It wasn't loud, just enough to get under my skin and make me uneasy. I told myself that I was overthinking it, that maybe the house had a squirrel in the attic or something. I didn't want to go upstairs to check it out, though, so I just stayed on the couch, trying to focus on my phone and pretend like I didn't hear anything. But after a while, the noises became harder to ignore. It started to sound like whispering, really faint, like someone was talking just loud enough to be heard, but not understood. That's when I decided to call the parents. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I figured I should at least ask if there was anything I needed to know about the house, like if there were animals in the attic, or some issue they'd had before. I called the mom's cell, and after a couple of rings, she picked up. I asked her as casually as I could if they'd ever had problems with animals in the attic, or if the house made weird noises at night. She sounded confused and told me that, as far as she knew, there was no attic. She said that the house had a crawl space above the second floor, but it was sealed off and there was no way anyone could get in there. She reassured me that everything was fine and told me not to worry, that old houses just make strange noises sometimes. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat there for a minute, trying to make sense of what she said. If there was no attic, then what was making the noise? I tried to calm myself down, but the more I thought about it, the more unnerved I felt. It didn't make sense. The noises were too clear, too specific to just be the house settling. I sat there for a while, listening. The noise had stopped for a bit, and I started to think maybe it really had just been my imagination. Maybe the house was just old and creaky, and I was freaking myself out for nothing. I went back to watching TV, trying to distract myself from the weird feeling I had. Then I heard it again, this time louder. It wasn't just footsteps now. It sounded like something was shifting, like furniture being moved or something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was directly above me, like it was coming from the ceiling. I stood up, my heart racing. I knew I couldn't just sit there anymore. I had to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made my way upstairs. The house was dead quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. I walked down the hall toward the kids' rooms, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything was normal. The kids were still asleep, and nothing seemed disturbed. I walked to the end of the hall, where there was a small door leading to the crawl space that the mom had mentioned. It was one of those low, square doors that you have to bend down to open, barely big enough for a person to fit through. I shined the flashlight at the door and saw that it was closed, with no sign of anyone having tampered with it. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to open it. My hand hovered over the handle, but something made me stop. I don't know if it was fear or just instinct, but I couldn't bring myself to open that door. Instead, I turned around and went back downstairs, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe it was just the wind outside or something rattling in the walls. I didn't know, but I wasn't going to stick my head into that crawl space to find out. I went back to the living room, sat on the couch, and just waited. I was too freaked out to sleep, and I didn't want to leave the kids alone upstairs. I kept the flashlight next to me and stared at the ceiling, listening for any more noises. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. The house was completely silent again. I sat there until the parents got home, around 1 a.m. They came in, a little tipsy from the party, and asked how the night went. I just smiled and told them everything was fine, that the kids were great, and that nothing unusual had happened. I didn't mention the noises. I didn't talk about the crawl space or the footsteps or the whispering. I didn't want to sound like a paranoid teenager making things up. So I left, went home, and tried to put it out of my mind. I met this guy on a dating app last fall, and for a while, everything seemed normal. We had been messaging back and forth for a few weeks before Halloween. His profile said his name was Jake, and he seemed nice enough. Pretty standard stuff for a dating app. He was good-looking, had a few decent photos, and we talked about typical things: work, hobbies, favorite movies. He said he lived in Boston, which wasn't far from where I lived in Brookline, and we talked about meeting up a few times before, but our schedules never lined up. It wasn't until around Halloween that we finally decided to meet up. He suggested we grab drinks at this bar in downtown Boston, a spot that was popular but not overly crowded on weeknights. It seemed like a safe choice, somewhere public and easy to get to. I agreed, feeling a little nervous but mostly excited. Meeting someone from a dating app always has that bit of anxiety attached to it, but I felt like I had talked to him long enough to feel comfortable. Nothing about our conversations had set off any red flags, and he seemed pretty normal, at least through text. The night we met, I got to the bar a little early, maybe 10 minutes or so. I sat at the bar and ordered a drink while I waited for him. I was halfway through my cocktail when I saw him walk in. He looked like his pictures, which was a relief. Same dark hair, tall, clean cut. He smiled when he saw me and came over to introduce himself. We talked for a bit, the usual small talk, nothing deep. He wasn't overly charming, but he seemed polite enough. There was something a little off about his demeanor, though. Not anything I could immediately put my finger on, but it was more like the vibe was just slightly off. I chalked it up to first date nerves, and we kept talking. The conversation was fine, but he started saying some weird things here and there, little comments that didn't really fit. He'd mention things about the neighborhood or specific details about the bar that were oddly specific for someone who claimed they hadn't been there before. He also made some offhand remarks about places in my area, which I hadn't told him much about, just that I lived in Brookline. I started feeling uncomfortable, but I didn't want to overthink it. Maybe he had just been to the area before and remembered more than he let on. I wasn't sure, but it didn't sit right with me. After about an hour, I decided it was time to head home. I made up an excuse about having to get up early for work and said I needed to go. He offered to walk me to my car, but I declined. I was parked just a couple of blocks away, and I figured it was better to leave things as they were and not extend the evening any longer. He didn't push the issue, just smiled and said he'd text me later. I left the bar and started walking back to my car. It was a cool October night, and the streets weren't too crowded. I had parked in one of the lots a few blocks away, And as I walked, I started thinking more about the night. Something about Jake had just felt wrong, even though I couldn't quite explain why. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe I was overreacting. Not every date goes perfectly, and not everyone clicks right away. As I was walking, I heard a car engine behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. Cars pass by all the time, especially in the city. But then the car slowed down as it got closer. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a familiar car driving slowly behind me. It was Jake's car. I hadn't paid much attention when he arrived at the bar, but I remembered seeing him pull up in this dark sedan. He didn't stop or say anything, just drove slowly behind me for a few seconds. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. I wasn't too far from my car now, and the street was still fairly well lit. But the fact that he was driving behind me after I had already said goodnight made my stomach drop. I picked up my pace a little, trying to act like I hadn't noticed him. After a minute or so, the car sped up and passed me. I watched as he drove ahead and turned the corner at the end of the block. I let out a breath, feeling relieved that he had driven off. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was leaving the bar the same time I was, and had to drive down the same street. It was possible, right? I tried to convince myself that it didn't mean anything. I got to my car, got in, and started driving home. I lived about 15 minutes away from the bar, so it wasn't a long drive. But as I got closer to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Jake's car following me again. But every time I checked, the street behind me was empty. I started to relax a little, feeling silly for being so paranoid. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building and parked my car. My building was a small, older place, nothing fancy, with about 10 units in total. The lot wasn't very big, but there were a few other cars parked there. I got out of my car, grabbed my bag, and started walking toward the entrance. That's when I saw it. Jake's car was parked at the end of the lot, just sitting there with the engine running. I froze for a second, my mind racing. How had he found my apartment? I hadn't told him where I lived, and there was no way he could have followed me. I'd been checking my rearview mirror the whole time, and he wasn't behind me. My heart started pounding as I stood there trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't just stand there in the parking lot, so I started walking toward the building, hoping he wouldn't do anything. I glanced over my shoulder as I reached the door, and I saw him sitting in his car, watching me. He wasn't trying to hide it. He just sat there, staring at me with this blank expression on his face. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and it took me a few tries to get the key into the lock. I finally got the door open and rushed inside, locking it behind me. I stood there for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? That a guy I met on a dating app was sitting in his car outside my apartment? It didn't seem like enough for them to do anything, but I was scared, more scared than I'd been in a long time. I went up to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I looked out the window, trying to see if Jake was still in the parking lot. His car was gone. I didn't know if he had left or just moved somewhere else, but I couldn't see him anymore. I closed the blinds and sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself down. I told myself that maybe I was overreacting again, that maybe it was just a weird coincidence, and he had parked in the same lot by accident. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept checking my phone, waiting to see if Jake would text me, but he never did. The next day I blocked his number and deleted the app. I didn't want to take any chances. For a while I was jumpy every time I left my apartment. I'd check the parking lot every time I came home, half expecting to see his car there again. But after a few weeks, nothing happened, and I started to relax. I told myself that maybe he had just been weirded out by the date, that maybe he wasn't stalking me or trying to follow me. Maybe it was all in my head. But then something happened that made me realize it wasn't just paranoia. A few weeks later, I got a notification from the dating app. It was an email saying that someone had tried to log into my account from a different device. The email said that if it wasn't me, I should change my password immediately. I hadn't logged into the app since that night, so I knew it wasn't me. I quickly changed my password and deleted the app for good. That's when I started thinking about how Jake had known so much about my neighborhood, about places near my apartment that I hadn't mentioned. I started wondering if he had somehow hacked into my account, or if he had been watching me for longer than I realized. The thought made my skin crawl. I haven't been on a dating app since. I can't bring myself to trust anyone I meet online anymore. Maybe that's an overreaction, but I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky nothing worse happened. I don't know what Jake's intentions were that night, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. A few years ago, me and a group of friends decided to go camping for Halloween weekend. We were all juniors in college at the time, and it seemed like the perfect way to get out of the city and do something different. We went to a spot we'd camped at a few times before, Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. It's a big lake, surrounded by miles of forest, with campgrounds scattered all around. We had been there a few times in the past, but always during the summer when it was busier. This time, it was late October, and the place was much quieter than usual. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Tyler, his girlfriend Jess, my roommate Matt, and a girl from our class named Amanda who had tagged along. We packed up our cars with tents, sleeping bags, food, and a cooler full of drinks, planning to spend the weekend out there. It wasn't too far from school, just a few hours' drive, and we figured we could relax, have some fun, and enjoy the fall weather before it got too cold. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was just starting to set, and the trees were a mix of red, orange, and yellow, casting long shadows across the ground. We were the only ones at the campsite, which didn't surprise us. Most people weren't camping this late in the season. It was colder than we expected, and the wind was picking up, rustling through the trees and making the air feel even chillier. We found a spot near the edge of the forest, not too far from the lake, and set up our tents. There was a fire pit nearby, so we gathered some wood and got a fire going to keep warm. By the time everything was set up, the sun had gone down, and it was getting dark fast. We sat around the fire, talking and drinking, just enjoying being away from everything for a while. It was quiet, aside from the crackling of the fire and the occasional breeze through the trees. After a while, we started telling stories. You know, the typical scary stories that always come up when you're camping. We joked about ghosts, serial killers, and creepy things lurking in the woods. It was fun, mostly just to freak each other out. We weren't taking it seriously, At least, not at first. But then around 10 p.m., we noticed something. Tyler was the first to point it out. He stopped mid-sentence and stared off into the woods behind us. He didn't say anything at first, just kept looking into the trees, like he was trying to figure out what he was seeing. We all turned to see what had caught his attention, but at first none of us noticed anything out of the ordinary. Then Jess saw it too. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the dim light from the fire. At first I thought it might have been a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or something, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was definitely someone standing there, just outside the reach of the firelight, watching us. It wasn't one of those moments where you scream or panic. We were all kind of stunned, not really sure what to do. The person, whoever it was, wasn't moving. They were just standing there, completely still. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of their figure against the dark trees. It looked like they were wearing some kind of dark jacket or hoodie, but I couldn't see their face. They were too far away, and the shadows made it impossible to make out anything clearly. We all just sat there for a minute, not saying anything, just staring. Finally, Tyler called out, asking who it was. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there. Tyler called out again, louder this time, but still nothing. At this point, we were starting to get freaked out. Whoever it was didn't seem like they were just passing by or lost. They were standing there on purpose, watching us. Tyler got up from his seat by the fire, and that's when the figure finally moved. They stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. We all stood up then, looking around, trying to see where they had gone, but there was nothing, just the trees and the darkness beyond. For a few minutes we just stood there, trying to figure out what had just happened. We debated whether to go look for the person, but none of us really wanted to go wandering into the woods at night. It was too dark, and we didn't have any weapons or anything. So we decided to stay by the fire, keeping it going and hoping that whoever it was would just leave us alone. The mood had definitely changed after that. None of us were in the mood for scary stories anymore. We all sat closer to the fire, talking in low voices, keeping an eye on the trees around us. Every little sound, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves, made us jump. It felt like the forest had come alive around us, like we weren't alone anymore. About an hour later, just when we were starting to calm down a little, we heard something. It was faint at first, like a soft crunching sound coming from the direction of the lake. We all went quiet, listening. The sound got louder, like someone was walking along the shore, their footsteps crunching on the gravel and rocks. It wasn't close, but it was definitely getting closer. Tyler grabbed a flashlight from his bag and shined it toward the lake. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but we didn't see anything at first. Then just for a second, we caught a glimpse of movement near the water. Something darting out of the light before we could see what it was. Tyler kept the flashlight trained on the spot, but there was nothing there now. Just the stillness of the lake and the trees. We all stood there, tense, waiting to see if something else would happen. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sound was the wind and the crackling of the fire. We decided to head back to the tents after that, figuring it was better to be inside than sitting out in the open by the fire. We put out the fire, packed up our stuff, and went to our tents. I shared a tent with Matt, while Tyler and Jess had their own, and Amanda was in a tent by herself. Once we were inside the tents, it got quiet again. I could hear Matt breathing next to me, and the sound of the wind outside, but that was it. No more footsteps, no more strange noises. I tried to tell myself that it was probably just some local messing with us. Maybe someone who lived nearby and thought it would be funny to scare a bunch of college kids camping out in the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the top of the tent, listening for any sound outside. For a while, there was nothing. Then sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft but steady, moving around the campsite. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking in a circle around the tents. I couldn't tell how many people there were. It could have been one person, or it could have been more. But they were close enough that I could hear every step. I didn't move, didn't say anything. I just lay there, listening, hoping that whoever it was would go away. The footsteps circled the tents for what felt like forever, then stopped. There was silence for a long time, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they had finally left. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of someone unzipping a tent. Not my tent, but one of the others. I couldn't tell which one, but the sound was unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to hear what would happen next. There was a long pause, then the sound of the tent being zipped back up. I heard footsteps again, this time moving away from the campsite, getting fainter until they disappeared into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, waiting for the sun to come up, listening to every little sound outside the tent. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted and on edge. The others were already up, sitting around the remains of the fire, looking as tired and shaken as I felt. No one said much at first, just exchanged nervous glances. Eventually, Tyler spoke up and asked if anyone had heard anything during the night. We all nodded, and I told them about the footsteps and the tent unzipping. Amanda went pale when I mentioned the tent. She said that in the middle of the night, she had woken up and thought she saw someone standing outside her tent. She thought it was just her imagination, but now she wasn't so sure. She hadn't said anything at the time because she didn't want to scare anyone. But now it seemed like we had all heard or seen something. We packed up our stuff quickly after that. None of us wanted to stick around any longer than we had to. As we were packing, we noticed something strange. The tents had been moved, just slightly, but enough that it was noticeable. They weren't in the exact same spots we had set them up in the night before. It was like someone had come through and shifted them around while we were sleeping. We left the campsite as soon as we could, driving back to school in silence. None of us really talked about what had happened after that. It was one of those things that you just don't want to dwell on too much. But it stuck with me, even now. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I've never been camping again since then. When I was a freshman in college, I joined a fraternity, mostly because I was looking for a way to meet people and make some friends. I didn't really know what I was getting into. Greek life wasn't really my scene, but a few of the guys from my dorm were rushing, and they convinced me to do it too. It felt like an easy way to fit in, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to try it out. So, I went along with it. The fraternity I joined wasn't one of the big, well-known ones on campus. It was smaller, more low-key, which I liked because it didn't seem like there'd be as much drama or pressure. But I quickly realized that they took their traditions pretty seriously, especially the hazing. It wasn't anything extreme like you hear about sometimes, but it was still pretty intense. Most of it was stupid stuff: drinking games, embarrassing challenges, running errands for the older guys. Nothing too dangerous, just annoying and humiliating. Then Halloween came around, and that's when things took a darker turn. Every year the frat had this tradition of sending the pledges to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town as part of a hazing ritual. We were supposed to spend the night there. No phones, no contact with the outside world, just us and the building. The whole point was to scare us and bond as a group or whatever. It sounded like a cliché haunted house thing, and at first, I didn't think it would be that bad. But when I heard where they were sending us, I got a little uneasy. The building was an old, abandoned mental hospital that had been shut down for decades. It was just outside of town, a place everyone knew about, but no one really talked about. It had a reputation. People said it was haunted, that weird things happened there, but I didn't believe in any of that. I wasn't afraid of ghosts or anything like that, but the idea of spending the night in a crumbling, abandoned building didn't exactly thrill me either. Still, it was part of the initiation, and I didn't want to be the one guy who backed out. So, on Halloween night, me and 4 other pledges got in a car and drove out to the place. It was about a 20-minute drive from campus, and by the time we got there, it was already dark. The hospital was exactly what you'd expect from an old abandoned building. Run down, overgrown with weeds, windows boarded up or shattered. The place was massive, with long hallways and crumbling walls. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The older guys had driven out ahead of us and were waiting by the entrance when we arrived. They handed us flashlights, told us the rules: no phones, no leaving the building until morning, and then locked the gate behind us. We were on our own. They thought it was hilarious, laughing and telling us to enjoy our night in the loony bin before driving off. We were supposed to stay there until dawn, and then they'd come back to pick us up. No big deal, right? We stepped inside the building, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was musty and damp, like the place had been rotting for years, which it probably had. The floors were covered in dust and debris, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. There were old beds and broken furniture scattered around, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. Some of the doors were missing, and others were barely hanging on by their hinges. The place was a wreck. The 5 of us stuck together at first, exploring the building with our flashlights. We joked around a bit, trying to keep things light, but it was clear that everyone was on edge. There was something about the place that just felt wrong. It wasn't anything supernatural or ghostly. It was just the atmosphere. The silence was oppressive, and every little sound seemed amplified. The wind outside howled through the broken windows, and the whole place creaked like it was about to collapse on top of us. After a while, we found a room that seemed relatively intact, with a few old mattresses on the floor. We decided to set up there for the night. We didn't have much in the way of supplies, just a couple of sleeping bags, some snacks, and a bottle of whiskey that one of the guys had brought along. We figured we'd stay in the room, drink a little, and wait for the night to be over. It wasn't long before we started hearing noises. At first, it was just the usual stuff: creaks, groans, the wind outside. But then there were footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. We all went quiet, listening. The footsteps would come and go, getting closer, then fading away again. It didn't make sense. We were supposed to be the only ones in the building, and there was no way the older guys could have gotten back in without us hearing them. We tried to ignore it at first, telling ourselves it was just the sound of the building settling or animals scurrying around. But as the night went on, the noises got louder. We'd hear what sounded like doors opening and closing in the distance, or furniture being dragged across the floor. Every time we thought it had stopped, it would start up again. At some point, one of the guys, Matt, decided he'd had enough. He said he was going to check it out, see if maybe the older guys were messing with us after all. He grabbed his flashlight and headed down the hall, leaving the rest of us in the room. We waited for a few minutes, expecting him to come back and tell us it was all a joke. But he didn't come back. We started getting nervous. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, we decided to go look for him. We grabbed our flashlights and headed out into the hallway, calling his name, but there was no response. We searched the floor, checking room after room, but there was no sign of him. That's when we found the fire. In one of the rooms at the end of the hall, there was a small fire pit, still smoldering with embers. It was clear that someone had been there recently. There were food wrappers and empty bottles scattered around, like someone had been living there. The sight of it made my stomach turn. Whoever had been staying there wasn't just passing through. They had set up camp, and we had no idea where they were now. The discovery of the fire freaked us out even more. We started arguing, debating whether we should leave or stay. The gate was locked, so it wasn't like we could just walk out and call it a night. We were stuck there until morning, like it or not. Eventually, we decided to go back to the room and wait. We figured it was safer to stick together than to keep wandering around the building. We barricaded the door with some of the old furniture we found and huddled together in the middle of the room, keeping our flashlights on and trying to stay awake. Every little noise made us jump, but we didn't hear the footsteps again. It was like whoever, or whatever, had been moving around had stopped. After what felt like the longest night of my life, the first light of dawn started to creep through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. We hadn't slept at all. When the sun finally came up, we packed up our stuff and waited for the older guys to come back. They showed up a little after 7 a.m., laughing and joking like they had no idea what had happened. We didn't tell them about the fire or the noises. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. As we were leaving, I couldn't help but glance back at the building. It looked the same as it had when we arrived. Old, broken down, empty. But now I knew better. It wasn't empty.